Большое спасибо. Здравствуйте. Я говорю медленно и плохо по-русски. So I am going to continue in English, and I hope you forgive me for that. It is a great honor to become part of the university in this way, and it's also, for me, very exciting to have a chance to bring some ideas to you about how the internet is evolving and how we may have to deal with it in an international setting. And I'm looking forward very much to the questions that you may have and the ideas that you choose to express at the end of my formal remarks. Let me begin, though, by reminding you a little bit of how this system actually works. When the idea of using packet switching was first considered in the early 1960s, most of the traditional telecommunications world thought that it was crazy. In the circuit switch world, which is the way the telephone system generally works, you reserve capacity at both ends and all the way across the network for the two parties to communicate. And even if no one is saying anything, the capacity is dedicated. In the packet switching world, it's quite different. It's more like cars on a big highway, and many cars can be in the same traffic lane as long as they're not in the same place. So when they don't run into each other, you get more use of the capacity than you would if you were to reserve one lane for one car all the way across the country. So packet switching was chosen to be a more efficient way of linking computers to each other. In order to make this work, you have to have some rules, and those rules are called protocols. And you also have to have a way of saying how to refer to the different places in the network. So every machine that's on the net has to have an address. And in order to do this, we went through many iterations in the early 1970s and came up with an address space, kind of like telephone numbers, that were 32 bits long. What that means is that we had enough room for 4.3 billion terminations, unique terminations on the internet. That decision was made in 1977. I made that decision while I was in the American Defense Department because at the time, the internet was still an experiment. And I didn't know whether it was going to work, but it seemed to me that 4.3 billion addresses was enough to do an experiment. What I didn't understand is that the experiment wasn't going to end. And so here we are in 2010, and we're still part of the experimental internet. And we're about to run out of room. We're running out of addresses. And so we're going to have to introduce a new address format called IP version 6, Internet Protocol version 6, which has 128 bits of addresses. That's 340 trillion addresses. And I hope that that's enough to last until after I'm dead, and then it will be someone else's problem if they need more. So this is what a typical internet packet looks like. It has a from address, a to address, and some contents. It's a lot like a postcard. So if you know how postcards work, you actually know a lot about how the internet works. Now, there are names and addresses in the internet, and names are things like www.google.com, and the addresses are the numeric ones. The IP version 4 addresses look like the 208.234 and so on. And the other more complicated looking address is the ones that we use to express the 128-bit IPv6 addresses. The system is built in a very layered fashion, and this turns out to be extremely important. It's important even from a policy point of view. I want to draw attention especially to the third level up, the one that says network. That's the internet protocol layer. It has a very interesting property. The first property is that the packets, the little electronic postcards, don't have any idea how they're being carried through the network. It was designed that way. The little packets don't know whether they're being carried on an optical channel, being carried over a satellite link, maybe carried over a radio link, or maybe even over a coaxial cable. The packets don't know how they're being carried. And the reason that that's important is that when we designed the network in 1973, my partner, Bob Kahn, and I knew that we did not know what new communication technologies would come along in the future. And we wanted to make the internet packets work on any new method of communicating. And so that decision turns out to have been very important, because as new technologies have come along, things like asynchronous transfer mode, mobiles, optical fiber, packet over SONET, all of those new technologies have been able to carry internet packets. So we've been able to bring the internet into, or to bring into the internet the use of these new communication and switching systems. So we sort of future-proofed the design of the network. But there's another property which is even more important. The packets of the internet do not know what kind of information they're carrying. All the packets know is that they have a little bag of bits, and they're supposed to bring the bits from point A to point B with some probability greater than 0. That's all that the packets know. They don't know whether those bits are a bit of audio, or maybe video, or part of a web page, or part of an email. They don't know. And the reason that turns out to be important is that when you want to add a new application on the internet, you don't have to change the IP layer, because it doesn't care what the application is. It doesn't care what the contents of the packets are. So in the course of 35 years, many, many new applications have been developed on the internet because it's completely insensitive to what applications are running. That has left people with the freedom to invent new applications without having to change the underlying structure of the system. So this permissionless invention, permissionless innovation, has turned out to be part of the reason the internet has exploded with new applications. So I've already talked about postcards. Let me explain something else now. The internet packets have all the same properties of postcards, so let me remind you. When you put a postcard into the postal box, there's no guarantee that it will come out on the other end. The Postal Service is what's called a best efforts service. Well, the internet is like that too. When you put an internet packet in the internet, there's no guarantee that it will come out the other end. If you put 2 postcards in the post box in a particular order, there's no guarantee they will be delivered in that order when they come out the other end. This is also true of internet packets. So you might, ask yourself, why would anyone want a network like this? Things don't stay in order and they get lost. Well, to overcome that simplicity, we put another layer of protocol on here. Let me see if the transport layer just above network layer, TCP, Transmission Control Protocol, is the method for overcoming the weaknesses of the IP layer. So the TCP protocol works roughly like this. Suppose that you had a book and you want to send it to a friend, but the only way the post office would carry anything is postcards. So the question is, how would you solve that problem? Well, the first thing you would do is tear the pages out of the book and cut them in half to fit on the postcards. And then you'd notice that not every postcard has a page number because you cut the pages in half. And you think, these postcards may get out of order, so I should number every postcard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so my friend can put them back in order when they arrive. Then you also remember that some of the postcards may get lost, so you keep copies of them just in case. And then you ask yourself, how would I know if I should send copies? And so you have an arrangement with your friend. You say, will you send me a postcard telling me which ones you already got? Send me a card saying, I got all the postcards up to number 420. And as soon as you get that postcard, you can throw away the copies because you know your friend has those. And then you realize that your friend's postcard might get lost. So now what do I do? And you say, well, I'll look at my watch, and if I haven't heard anything from my friend in a while, I'll start sending copies until I do get a postcard back saying I got everything up to that number. Well, that's basically how the TCP works. The only other issue is that well, let's suppose you had a 1,000-page novel, and you cut it up into 2,000 postcards, and you take it to the post office, and you give it to them all at once. And by some miracle, they try to deliver all 2,000 postcards at the same time to your friend's postbox. And the postbox can't hold them all. So some of them would fall on the ground, and the dogs would eat them, or the wind would blow them away. So you have to have an agreement with your friend to say, okay, I won't send more than 200 postcards at a time until I get back a postcard from you saying you got all of them. That's called flow control. You just learned how the TCP works. In fact, you now know how the internet works. There are some other little details, but that's the basic element of the way the network functions. So now we're all experts. The original experiments with packet switching started in the late 1960s and went on until 1990, funded by the American Defense Department. When the ARPANET project, the experimental packet switching project, was very successful, the Defense Department asked, well, what can we do if we use computers in command and control? The idea was that if you could use a computer to manage your resources, you might be able to overcome an opponent who has more resources but doesn't manage them as well. But if you're serious about using computers in command and control, they have to show up in airplanes and in helicopters and in ground mobile vehicles and in ships at sea. And you can't use wires to connect those together. The tanks run over the wires and they break. So you have to use radio and satellite. So we started experimenting with this packet switching idea using mobile radio and using packet satellite in the 1970s. And that led to a very fundamental problem. If you have different kinds of packet switch nets, some using satellite or radio or wires, how do you get them all to interconnect in a way that is seamless to all of the computers that are attached on any network? That was the internet problem, and that was the problem that Bob Kahn and I solved in 1973. Since that time, of course, many networks have been built based on this idea. A very important one in the United States was called the NSF-Net, the National Science Foundation Network, which connected all of the American universities together on an increasingly high-speed internet backbone. I got my start in this whole process as a graduate student at UCLA. I wrote the software that connected the Sigma 7 machine to the first node of the ARPANET in September of 1969. By December, we had 4 computers connected together. Not a very big network, but an important experiment. The Sigma 7 computer is in a museum now, and some people think I should be in the museum too, but in any case, here I am. This was a very successful experiment, and today, if you look at the internet, which has resulted, you see something like this. This is actually an automatically generated image of the internet. The different colors represent different networks that are run independently of each other. So each color is what we call an autonomous system, and it's operated by a company or a university or a government agency. They are all voluntarily interconnected. There's no central control. And that's important. When you think about policy and internet, you have to remember there is no central control. So what you're seeing here is a gigantic global collaboration among people who have built pieces of internet, have voluntarily interconnected those pieces. And the only reason it works is that they all use the same TCP/IP standards. There are lots of different ways in which these systems can be connected. Some networks connect directly to each other with dedicated circuits. Some of them will connect at public access points, internet exchange points. And this way, multiple parties can meet and exchange traffic in one place. Another possibility is that you purchase internet access from someone else, and that other network operator promises to take your packets and deliver them anywhere in the internet, anywhere in the world, for the fee that you pay. So there are lots of different ways of interconnecting, and there aren't any regulations. These are all business decisions made by the independent operators. So an internet exchange point is typically like a data center where people put their routers and connect them to their networks, and the routers become interconnected at that data center. And that's where the packets are exchanged to form that connected network that I showed you before. There are many, sometimes more than one internet exchange in each country. Some of them are government-sponsored, some of them are for-profit, and some of them are not-for-profit. Again, this is a very open environment, and different entities, different organizations can choose how they want to operate in the internet world. An internet service provider typically offers access to the internet, something that moves the electronic packets around, but they may also offer connectivity, the transit and peering. They may offer the translation of domain names into internet addresses, and some of them will offer applications like electronic mail or web services, or maybe hosting. So if you have an application that you want to run on the internet, but you don't want to have the computers to run it, you can hire someone else to run the computers and put your application on it. Google is a good example of some of that. We have lots of applications running in our data centers, and other people get to through the internet to those data centers and to those applications. Now, something historically interesting has happened this year. For most of its lifetime in the internet, the domain names of the net have been written in Latin characters. And so every generic top-level domain like .com or .net, and every international domain or country code has been written with 2 characters, like Afghanistan is .af, Russia here is .ru. But that's now changing. The internet has now adopted the use of the Unicode encoding in order to represent characters from other kinds of scripts. So, for example, top-level domains have been assigned by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers to non-Latin characters. For example, China has 2 top-level domains, one expressed in simplified Chinese and one expressed in traditional Chinese. Egypt has a new top-level domain that's written in Arabic. You have one that's written in Cyrillic called RF, which stands for, of course, for the Russian Federation. Now, you still have the Latin character top-level domains as well, but now we have both. Part of the motivation behind this is to allow users to have domain names that are expressed in their local languages, in addition to the older method of expressing them in Latin characters. There are more of them coming as time goes on. Now, there's a big policy problem here, and it takes a minute to be clear why. If you look at a domain name, one of the most important characteristics of the domain name is that each one is unique. So only one party can be assigned a domain name. www.google.com is only assigned, in this case, to Google and not to anyone else. You can imagine the confusion if you assign a domain name to 2 different parties. So then how do you know which of the 2 you're supposed to send your traffic to, or which site you're supposed to go to? there would be confusion. So the domain name system was designed to have every domain name be uniquely assigned to one party. Unfortunately, the trademark law and trademark history allows the same trademark to be assigned to more than one party. So you can have the ABC equipment manufacturing company, and you can have the ABC bread company. Both have the same trademark, ABC. The trouble is only one of them can have abc.com because the domain name system doesn't recognize the possibility of multiple trademark assignment. So there's a collision in policy. And there's no good resolution to that right now because the domain name system doesn't have the same properties as trademark. So it's an example of a place where historical precedent and current technology don't line up very well. Another interesting thing that's happening is that television has come to the internet, or maybe the other way around, the internet has come to television. People are using the ordinary internet packets to carry video. I'm sure you've seen YouTube, but you've probably seen other video offerings as you go from one website to another. I believe that we're going to end up seeing the video medium transformed by its presence in the internet. And the best way for me to emphasize this is to say that in the historical implementation of television, sound and video were captured together and transmitted as a single unit to a television set. In the internet world, each of the media, the sound, the video, and maybe even text or other material is sent independently as streams of packets so that they're distinguishable at the receiving end. What this means is that the device that's receiving this information can process it independently. And in our world, I don't know if I have a slide for this, but in our world at Google, we take advantage of the fact that these streams of information are independent and can be processed separately. So, for example, if you want to caption the television program, and the caption stream, the text of what is being said, if the caption stream is independent of the video, then when it's received at the far end, it's possible to translate into different languages. So in our YouTube offering, we generate the captions automatically if it's in English. We haven't learned to do this yet in other languages. But if it's an English language dialogue, we automatically recognize the English language, produce captions, and then we can translate those captions from English into 53 different languages. We can only do this because the caption stream is separate from the video, and we can manipulate it when we receive it at the far end. Gmail is another example of an application on the internet. Electronic mail was invented in 1971 on the ARPANET. It was the first big application, and it continues to be one of the most common applications on the net. Instant messaging and chatting with each other, and of course on the mobiles, SMS, are all very popular. You could see where this is heading. The internet started out as a project to connect computers together, but it turned out to be a network to connect people together. And so the social aspect of the internet has turned out to be as important, or maybe more important, than its technical use to connect computers together. Twitter is another example of a communication medium which has come to the internet by way of mobiles. Google Maps is another application that people make heavy use of, especially if they're trying to find their way from one place to another. Producing maps of the entire world and making them available to people online, and particularly available to them on their mobiles, means that you don't have any excuse for being lost anymore. Between the GPS system and the Google Maps, or its analog from other companies, you should always be able to find out where you are. I mentioned YouTube already. Here's an issue at YouTube. The video is contributed by the viewers. We don't produce any of the video at Google. This video is uploaded to us. In fact, we get about 24 hours of video per minute uploaded into the internet. 24 hours per minute is uploaded into YouTube. There's no way that we could possibly look at all of the video as it's coming in, and we don't. So there are issues. Suppose that someone uploads a film that is owned by someone else. It's copyright by someone else. Well, under international law, copyright violations are considered illegal, and you have to do something about that. The conclusion that we reached at Google, as have others, is that since we can't look at all the video ahead of time, we allow people to tell us, we just saw a video that is copyright and you should check to see whether or not it should be taken down because it's a copyright violation. So we rely on a convention called notice and takedown, which means that when we are given notice at Google about a possible violation, we will then pay attention to that, determine whether or not there is an issue, and if there is a violation, we will take it off of the YouTube system. This is the only way that we have found to cope with the amount of video that has come up. The same issue arises with audio. Some people use music when they produce these videos for YouTube, and the music may actually be copyright, and there are questions about permissions. And once again, we would take things down if we're told that the audio belongs to someone else. Now, I chose to use a Spanish language example here. I don't happen to speak Spanish, just like I don't speak Russian either. In fact, there's a really terrible joke about Americans. You know, if you speak 3 languages, you're trilingual. If you speak 2 languages, you're bilingual. If you speak 1 language, you're an American. And so this was a story that was written in El País, which is a fairly large circulation Spanish newspaper, and it came out in Spanish. So I took the URL of the web page and I sent it to Google Translate. So I didn't cut and paste the text. I just sent the web URL to our translation system, and it reproduced the web page, but all the Spanish has been translated into English. And the translation is actually not too bad. So we make heavy use of translation capabilities to help bring people together. There are some very hard problems associated with internet in the legal space. I'm not going to have time to go through every single one of these, but we already talked about intellectual property, and it's the collision that we have with intellectual property in the World Wide Web. Let me remind you about how the World Wide Web works. When you have a browser in your laptop or in your mobile, the way the browser works is it reaches out into the internet and copies the home page of that website. It copies a file, and then it interprets the file and presents it to you. So the World Wide Web is a giant copying engine. Well, if you are interested in copyright, if you're interested in controlling who can make copies of things, the World Wide Web is a big threat because it essentially collides with your model of copyright. So we are going to have to learn how to cope with the technology which does copying in the normal course of operation and our current treatment of intellectual property and compensation. It probably is going to require a fair amount of invention by the engineers and by the lawyers to figure out how to compensate people for their work while at the same time keeping the World Wide Web as open as possible. There are other issues like things bad things that happen to someone in one country. Maybe someone has committed a fraud. I don't know if you get them here, but in the United States we get letters from Nigeria saying that there's $128 million sitting in a bank and the Nigerian would like help getting it transferred into another account. And if you could just send him $10,000 so that he can do the transaction, he's happy to give you half of the money. Well, we call this fraud. Of course, if anybody believes it, we call that stupidity. But for the most part, it's a fraud. And if someone is harmed by the fraud, the question is, what to do? Well, if the person committing the fraud is in Nigeria and the victim is here in Russia or in the United States, the question is, in which jurisdiction can this fraud be addressed? Do we have any global agreements about what is fraud and how we should react to it, how we should enforce rules and laws that say that you shouldn't do that? There are no international agreements yet dealing specifically with harm that occurs through the internet, especially between countries. There are also all kinds of other problems. There's all kinds of information on the internet that's wrong. In fact, probably the most important lesson we can teach our kids is not to believe everything that they see on the internet, because sometimes it's there by accident, sometimes it's there because it's deliberate misinformation, sometimes it's there just because of a misunderstanding. We need to be skeptical of the information that we see in the internet, and we need to remind ourselves that we should double-check the sources before we believe what we're reading. There's questions about taxation. If a transaction takes place on the internet, you buy a book at Amazon, or you buy a book through an online dealer here in Russia, the question is, where are the taxes? Are there any taxes, and where do they get paid? We don't have any rules for that either. And as you can see, there's a long list on the right-hand side, concerns about privacy and confidentiality. E-commerce. If you and I conduct a transaction on the net, and we use digital signatures in order to sign the contract between us, one question is, what's the value of a digital signature? Is there any legal structure? Is there any international agreement that says if there is a digital contract, digitally signed contract, and one of the parties violates a term of the contract, in which jurisdiction is one to address that problem, that dispute? We don't have agreements about that either. There are other issues that some of you will be very familiar with. Cryptography is becoming very important in the internet, partly to protect confidentiality, partly in order to support digital signatures, or even to protect the domain name system. But there are questions about export of these kinds of technologies. In the United States, the term dual use is sometimes used to say this technology could be used for commercial purposes, but the same technology could be used for military purposes, and there is a policy question, should this export be permitted or not? And it would not surprise me if there are similar concerns here in your government. There are questions about general regulation of the layers of the internet. Who has access to the basic internet transport system? Who has access to the applications that run in the internet? Should there be an open arrangement so that anyone here can get access to any internet service anywhere in the world? That would be the kind of open internet which has been, in my opinion, very beneficial for the last 30 years. So this regulatory framework is an issue. I've already mentioned dispute resolution and trying to decide in which jurisdiction these disputes could be resolved, especially when they're global in nature. The convergence of television, radio, and telephony is raising other major problems in policy. In the United States, for example, the telephone system is regulated differently from cable television. That's regulated differently from broadcast radio. And the internet is yet a fourth thing. And we're still struggling in the United States over what the regulatory framework should be. Things have gotten very confusing because the internet is supporting all of the old communications media. It's supporting essentially radio, television, print publication, and of course all the interactive applications of the internet. So it is not like the special purpose networks that were designed for one thing. In fact, the internet was not designed for any particular purpose at all. it was designed to be general purpose, and of course, we see the regulatory consequences of that. Some of us, and I suspect some of you as well, are very worried about security on the internet. Part of the reason for worrying about it is that it's not just an academic network anymore. This is something that we rely on every day. We use it to exchange personal information with our friends. We use it to conduct business. We use it to connect governments with its citizens. We use it for international communication. If it doesn't work, there are economic consequences. If privacy isn't maintained, there are personal consequences. If there are business transactions that are impeded or affected by failure in the internet or by denial of service attacks, that has economic consequences. So there are quite a few different ways in which the internet can be abused and can have distinct harms occurring to persons or to businesses or to governments. So these are major concerns. And so one of the questions is how to address many of those security concerns. A lot of people immediately leap to the conclusion that a security problem must have to do with law enforcement, that the violation of security is a violation of a law and should be treated that way. Some of us are beginning to think we should be more nuanced in our thinking. In particular, I want you to think about a fire department and what it does. Imagine that your house is on fire and you're sitting there with a garden hose and it doesn't have a whole lot of water to put on the fire. And I know fires are on your mind because you've been having a lot of them here in the last month or so. In order to fight a fire seriously, the fire department comes with a pumping truck and a really big hose and pours a lot of water onto the fire to put it out. There are companies and individuals and organizations who do not have the expertise to put out a cyber fire. They don't have the expertise to fend off a denial of service attack. But we could imagine a cyber fire department that you could call that does have that expertise. Now, the analogy is not perfect, but it's very interesting. In the United States, a fire department does more than put out fires. After the fire is out, it inspects the premises to see whether the fire was started on purpose. And if it was, that's a law enforcement problem. It's called arson. And if you can find the party who did that, it's a violation and there are penalties. So you can imagine a cyber fire department helping to put out the fire, fending off an attack, getting rid of a virus or a worm, and then trying to help you figure out whether or not this came from some outside party. And if it did, then you start treating that as a possible law enforcement problem. So I think the analogy is fairly good. In most fire department situations, anyone who sees a fire is allowed to call the fire department to tell them to put it out. In the cyber fire world, it's not so clear that you would want just anyone to call and say the cyber fire department should show up and start working on your network. It might have to be a voluntary proposition. But it shows that there are lots of opportunities for some international agreements. Sometimes these cyber fires start in one country and they propagate to other countries. If we don't have international agreements in which we work together to help put out the cyber fire, it may be impossible. So we need to have some international possibilities. There are other examples that I've listed here, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to detail them. I just want to say that there's a substantial open field right now for policy development with regard to the use of internet and the protection of citizens from attacks and other kinds of abuse in this global environment. The U.S. has a number of organizations that are involved in internet governance, our Department of Commerce, our Federal Communications Commission, the Department of State, and the Department of Justice are just examples of those who are involved, and you probably have very similar kinds of organizations here. Internationally, you find the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, the regional Internet registries that hand out Internet address space, the Internet Society, which is responsible for organizing the standard development of the Internet in its Internet Engineering Task Force, and also expressing opinions about policy and assisting in the further development of Internet in the developing world. And of course, others you probably recognize as well, the International Telecommunications Union, which was originally started when telegraphy was invented in the 19th century, a number of UN programs like the UN Development Program or UNESCO and ECOSOC, and coming up in September, the Internet Governance Forum, which emerged out of the World Summit on the Information Society. The Governance Forum meets once a year. This year it will meet in Vilnius, in the capital of Lithuania, and some of us are going to be at that meeting. And we will be discussing a lot of the issues that I raised earlier in this talk. So just to quickly pick up a few of the big policy issues that are coming, we're very worried about the exhaustion of the IP version 4 address space. We don't see as much uptake and implementation of IPv6, and we need to encourage that so the Internet can continue to grow. I'm concerned about the meaning of digital signatures on a global basis. I'm concerned about intellectual property protection in this Internet environment, and also deciding where policy should be designed and implemented. For example, some policies could be done in the World Trade Organization, some might be done in the World Intellectual Property Organization, and in some cases we may have to invent new institutions in order to cope with Internet policy development. I think that may be the end of the slides here because it doesn't want to go anywhere. Well, that's interesting. All right, so then I'm going to stop with the slides. And I notice I've already taken up an hour of your time. What I would like to suggest to you is that if you have an interest in policy development, and I hope you do because you're here at this university, you have an enormous opportunity to contribute because there are very few, if any, agreements in place right now, especially international agreements, to deal with a lot of these policy issues. If you studied history, you'll know about the law of the sea. It took about 20 years to develop that treaty, and it covers another common environment, the oceans of this planet. The Internet is another big digital ocean. It's one that we all share, and it's one that needs to have international agreements about how we protect people's interests in this common environment. So I'm going to stop there, and I thank you, Большое спасибо, for the time this morning, and I'm happy to try to respond to any questions that you may have.